Tony Bennett stared at the official summons in disbelief. At 97 years old, he had never expected to be called for jury duty, and part of him wondered if this was some kind of administrative error. The letter was addressed to Anthony Benedetto, his legal name, rather than his stage name, which explained why the court system had tracked him down despite his celebrity status. "Susan," he called to his wife, who was reading in the living room, "I've been summoned for jury duty." Susan looked up from her book with surprise. "At your age, can't you get an exemption?" Tony studied the summons carefully. "I could probably get out of it, but honestly, I've never served on a jury before. It might be interesting to see how the justice system actually works." 3 weeks later, Tony found himself in a crowded jury assembly room at the New York County Criminal Court, surrounded by dozens of other potential jurors from all walks of life. He had dressed conservatively in a dark suit and kept his head down, hoping to avoid recognition. The last thing he wanted was for his celebrity status to influence the jury selection process. The case they were being considered for was People v. Vincent Michael Torrino, a fraud and racketeering trial. Tony felt his blood chill when he heard the name. Vincent Torrino had been the surname of the mob figure who had tried to control his career in the 1960s, but Vincent Torrino Sr. had been dead for decades. This must be a relative, perhaps a son or nephew. During voir dire, when potential jurors were questioned about their backgrounds and potential biases, Tony answered honestly but carefully. Yes, he had some familiarity with entertainment industry figures who had been connected to organized crime. No, he didn't think this would prevent him from being impartial. When asked about his profession, he simply said, "retired entertainer," and the attorney moved on without probing further. To his surprise, Tony was selected for the jury. As they were led into the courtroom for the trial's opening statements, Tony got his first clear look at the defendant, and his heart nearly stopped. Vincent Michael Torrino was 58 years old, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that looked remarkably familiar. But it wasn't just a family resemblance that Tony recognized. This was Michael Torrino, a man Tony had known personally 40 years ago, though apparently under a different name. In 1983, Tony had befriended a struggling jazz musician named Michael Torres, who performed at small clubs around Manhattan. Michael had been talented but unlucky, never quite finding his break in the music industry. Tony had taken an interest in the younger man's career, occasionally inviting him to perform as an opening act, even helping him secure a few recording sessions. Their friendship had lasted about 2 years, until Michael had suddenly disappeared from the New York music scene without explanation. Tony had assumed he had either given up on music or moved to another city to pursue opportunities elsewhere. He had never seen or heard from Michael Torres again, until now. But according to the indictment being read by the prosecutor, the defendant's real name was Vincent Michael Torrino, son of Vincent Torrino Sr., and he was being charged with multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and racketeering in connection with an elaborate scheme involving the entertainment industry. As Tony listened to the opening statements, a horrifying picture began to emerge. For the past 15 years, Vincent Michael Torrino had been running a sophisticated operation that used fake entertainment companies to launder money from various criminal enterprises. He had created dozens of shell companies that supposedly managed musicians, produced recordings, and organized concerts, all fake operations designed to move illegal money through seemingly legitimate entertainment industry transactions. But what made Tony's stomach turn was the realization that his friendship with Michael Torres had likely been part of a long-term strategy. Vincent Torrino Jr. had deliberately cultivated relationships with legitimate entertainers in the 1980s, using those connections to establish credibility for his later criminal activities. The defendant, the prosecutor continued, used his connections to well-known performers to legitimize his fake entertainment businesses. He would claim that famous musicians were clients or collaborators, using their reputations to convince investors and business partners that his companies were legitimate. Tony's hands began to shake as he realized the implications. His friendship with Michael Torres, Vincent Torrino Jr., had been exploited for decades to support criminal activities. Every kindness he had shown, every professional favor he had done, every connection he had helped Michael make had potentially been used to facilitate money laundering and fraud. During the lunch break, Tony agonized over whether he should disclose his personal connection to the defendant. Legally, he was required to inform the court if he had any relationship with the parties involved in the case. But revealing his identity would almost certainly result in his dismissal from the jury, and he was beginning to feel that serving on this jury might be the only way to ensure justice was done. More troubling was his growing realization that if Vincent Torrino Jr. was convicted, Tony's testimony about their friendship might be crucial evidence. The prosecution was trying to prove that Torrino had deliberately cultivated relationships with legitimate entertainers to support his criminal enterprises. Tony's account of their friendship could provide exactly the kind of evidence needed to establish that pattern of behavior. But testifying against Michael, Vincent, would mean betraying someone who had been his friend, even if that friendship had been based on deception. When court reconvened, Tony made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He said nothing about his personal connection to the defendant, convincing himself that he could remain impartial despite their history. As the trial progressed over the following weeks, Tony learned more disturbing details about Vincent Torrino Jr.'s criminal activities. The man he had known as a struggling musician had actually been a sophisticated criminal who had used music industry connections to facilitate millions of dollars in money laundering operations. Witnesses testified about fake recording contracts, phantom concerts that never took place, and shell companies that existed only on paper but claimed to represent major entertainment figures. In several cases, Torrino had used Tony Bennett's name specifically, claiming business relationships that didn't exist, and forging documents that suggested Tony had endorsed or participated in various projects. The defendant told investors that Tony Bennett was planning to record an album with his production company, testified one witness. He showed them contracts and correspondence that appeared to be signed by Mr. Bennett. Based on that fake documentation, we invested $200,000 in what we thought was a legitimate recording project. Tony felt sick hearing his name invoked in connection with these fraudulent schemes. His friendship with Vincent had been exploited not just for general credibility, but for specific financial crimes that had defrauded innocent investors. But the most damaging testimony came from former associates of Vincent Torrino Jr., who described his strategy for infiltrating the entertainment industry. Vincent always said that the key to successful money laundering was having legitimate friends, testified a former associate who had been given immunity in exchange for his cooperation. He spent years cultivating relationships with real musicians and entertainers. He would help them with small projects, do them favors, establish personal connections. Then he would use those relationships to validate his fake businesses. The witness continued, "He specifically mentioned Tony Bennett as one of his most valuable connections. He said that being able to claim a friendship with Tony Bennett opened doors and created trust that would have been impossible to achieve otherwise." Tony realized that his kindness and generosity had been systematically exploited by someone he had considered a friend. Every favor he had done for Michael Torres had been used to facilitate criminal activities that had harmed innocent people. As the prosecution rested its case, Tony faced an impossible choice. The evidence against Vincent Torrino Jr. was strong but not overwhelming. The defense was arguing that their client had been a legitimate businessman who had made some questionable deals, but hadn't committed intentional fraud. They were presenting Vincent as someone who had been in over his head, rather than as a deliberate, criminal mastermind. Tony knew that his testimony about their friendship could provide crucial evidence about Vincent's deliberate strategy of cultivating entertainment industry connections for criminal purposes. But testifying would mean revealing his identity as a juror who had concealed his relationship with the defendant, an action that could result in a mistrial and allow Vincent to escape justice entirely. During jury deliberations, Tony found himself in the agonizing position of knowing facts that could influence the verdict, but being unable to share them with his fellow jurors. As they debated the evidence, Tony listened to arguments about whether Vincent's actions had been intentional fraud or merely poor business judgment. "I just don't see enough evidence of deliberate criminal intent," said one juror. "Yes, his businesses failed and people lost money, but that happens in the entertainment industry. I'm not convinced he set out to defraud anyone." Tony wanted desperately to share what he knew about Vincent's deliberate strategy of cultivating entertainment industry friendships for criminal purposes, but doing so would require revealing his own connection to the case. Another juror disagreed. "The pattern is too consistent to be accidental. Creating dozens of fake companies, using forged documents, claiming connections to celebrities. That's not poor judgment. That's systematic fraud." "But where's the proof that he deliberately set out to deceive people? Most of the evidence is circumstantial." Tony realized that the jury was leaning toward acquittal, not because Vincent was innocent, but because they couldn't see the full scope of his criminal strategy. Without Tony's testimony about their friendship and how it had been exploited, the prosecution's case appeared weaker than it actually was. On the second day of deliberations, Tony made a decision that went against everything he had ever believed about loyalty and friendship. During a break, he approached the bailiff and requested to speak with the judge privately. "Your Honor," Tony said when he was brought into the judge's chambers, "I need to disclose something that should have been revealed during jury selection. My name is Anthony Benedetto, but I'm professionally known as Tony Bennett. I had a personal relationship with the defendant 40 years ago, when he was using the name Michael Torres." Judge Patricia Morrison looked stunned. "Mr. Bennett, this is highly irregular. Why didn't you reveal this information during voir dire?" "I didn't realize the connection initially, and then I thought I could remain impartial. But I've learned information during this trial that I believe is crucial to the case, and I can't in good conscience continue serving on this jury without disclosing what I know." Judge Morrison called an immediate conference with both attorneys. Tony found himself in the unprecedented position of being a sitting juror who needed to become a witness in the case he was helping to decide. "This is a mess," the defense attorney argued. "Mr. Bennett has been exposed to all the evidence and jury deliberations. His testimony would be tainted by privileged information he gained as a juror." The prosecutor disagreed. "Mr. Inshaw, Bennett's relationship with the defendant is exactly the kind of evidence this case needs. His testimony could provide crucial insight into the defendant's strategy of cultivating entertainment industry connections for criminal purposes." Judge Morrison made a difficult decision. She declared a mistrial, dismissed the jury, and ordered that a new trial be scheduled with Tony Bennett as a witness for the prosecution rather than as a juror. Tony felt devastated by the outcome. His failure to disclose his relationship with Vincent had resulted in weeks of wasted time and resources, and had allowed Vincent to remain free on bail for additional months while a new trial was prepared. When the new trial began 6 months later, Tony took the witness stand and told the truth about his friendship with Michael Torres, Vincent Torrino Jr. His testimony was devastating to the defense's argument that Vincent had been merely an unlucky businessman rather than a deliberate criminal. Mr. Torrino cultivated our friendship very deliberately, Tony testified. He was always asking questions about how the music industry worked, who the important players were, how business relationships were formed. At the time, I thought he was just an eager young musician trying to learn. Now I understand he was gathering intelligence for criminal purposes. Tony's testimony helped establish the pattern of deliberate deception that the prosecution needed to prove their case. Vincent Torrino Jr. was ultimately convicted on 14 counts of fraud and money laundering and sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. But Tony's victory felt hollow. He had been forced to betray someone who had been his friend, even though that friendship had been based on lies. He had also compromised his own integrity by initially concealing his relationship with the defendant. After the trial, Tony received a letter from Vincent Torrino Jr. in prison. The letter was both an apology and an explanation that provided Tony with some closure about their complicated relationship. "Mr. Bennett," the letter began, "I want you to know that while our friendship began as part of my strategy to infiltrate the entertainment industry, it became genuine very quickly. You were kind to me when you had no reason to be, and you helped my career when most established performers wouldn't give a struggling musician the time of day. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, or how I used our friendship for criminal purposes, but I want you to know that my affection and respect for you were real, even if my identity was false. You did the right thing by testifying against me. I was guilty of everything they charged me with, and more. The fact that you were able to overcome your loyalty to our friendship in service of justice shows the kind of character that made me admire you in the first place. I'm sorry for putting you in an impossible position. I'm sorry for exploiting your kindness. And I'm sorry for using your good name to facilitate crimes that hurt innocent people. I hope someday you can forgive me, not for who I pretended to be, but for who I actually was underneath the lies. Someone who genuinely appreciated your friendship, even while betraying it." Tony never responded to the letter, but he kept it in his desk drawer as a reminder of how complicated the relationships between loyalty, truth, and justice could become. The jury duty experience taught Tony painful lessons about the exploitation of trust and the difficulty of knowing when personal loyalty should give way to larger principles of justice. It also taught him that even at 97 years old, he could still be surprised by the complexity of human relationships and the long-term consequences of choices made decades earlier. But perhaps most importantly, it taught him that doing the right thing often requires betraying people who don't deserve loyalty, and that sometimes the most important friendships are the ones that end with the courage to tell the truth about someone you care about, even when that truth destroys the relationship forever. Years later, when Tony was asked about his experience serving on a jury, he would say simply, "I learned that justice isn't about protecting your friends from the consequences of their actions. It's about protecting innocent people from being harmed by those actions. Sometimes being a good friend means being a good witness, even when it costs you the friendship." The jury duty summons that had seemed like an inconvenience had become one of the most morally challenging experiences of Tony's life, forcing him to choose between personal loyalty and public duty, between the comfort of silence and the difficulty of speaking truth about someone he had cared about. In the end, Tony chose justice over friendship, truth over loyalty, and the protection of innocent people over the preservation of a relationship that had been built on deception from the beginning. It was the right choice, but it was also one that reminded him that even at the end of a long and successful life, there were still moral tests that could challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the people he trusted. But the story didn't end with Vincent's conviction. 3 months after the trial, Tony received an unexpected visit from Detective Sarah Rodriguez of the NYPD Financial Crimes Unit. "Mr. Bennett," Detective Rodriguez explained as she sat in Tony's living room, "Vincent Torrino Jr.'s conviction has opened up several new investigations into his criminal network. We've discovered that his operations were much more extensive than we originally thought. And your name appears in documents related to crimes that go back decades." Tony felt his heart sink. "What kind of crimes?" Torrino kept detailed records of his operations, including documentation of how he used legitimate entertainment industry figures to validate his criminal enterprises. Your name appears in files dating back to 1985, suggesting that he's been exploiting your friendship far longer than anyone realized. Detective Rodriguez opened a briefcase and pulled out copies of documents that made Tony's blood run cold. There were forged contracts claiming that Tony Bennett had agreed to perform at concerts that never existed. There were fake correspondence suggesting Tony had endorsed investment opportunities that were actually money laundering schemes. There were even photographs of Tony with Vincent from the 1980s that had been used to create false advertising for criminal enterprises. "We've identified at least 12 different criminal schemes where Torrino used your name without permission," the detective continued. "These crimes defrauded investors of more than $8 million over 30 years. Tony stared at the documents in horror. "Are you saying that my friendship with Vincent was part of criminal activities for 30 years? We believe Torrino viewed your friendship as one of his most valuable criminal assets. He documented every interaction, photographed every event you attended together, and kept detailed records for the purpose of supporting future criminal activities." Detective Rodriguez showed Tony a particularly damning document, a handwritten memo from Vincent to his criminal associates dated 1987, outlining his strategy for using entertainment industry friendships. "The Bennett connection continues to be our most valuable legitimacy asset," the memo read. "TB trusts me completely and has no suspicion that our relationship serves any purpose other than friendship. His willingness to include me in industry events and introduce me to other performers has provided access that would be impossible to achieve through any other means. Recommend continuing cultivation of this relationship indefinitely." Tony felt sick reading Vincent's cold calculation of their friendship. Every moment of genuine connection, every act of kindness, every professional favor had been documented and analyzed for its potential criminal utility. "Detective Rodriguez," Tony said, "what you're showing me suggests that Vincent Torrino Jr. committed crimes using my identity for 30 years. Why wasn't any of this discovered until now?" Torrino was very sophisticated about compartmentalizing his operations. He used different identities for different schemes, and he was careful never to put all the pieces together in ways that would reveal the full scope of his criminal enterprise. It was only after his conviction that we gained access to his complete records and were able to see how everything connected. The detective explained that Tony's testimony during the trial had been more important than anyone realized. It had provided the missing piece that helped investigators understand how Torrino's entire criminal network had operated. Your description of how Torrino cultivated your friendship gave us the key to understanding his method for infiltrating legitimate entertainment industry circles. Once we understood his strategy, we were able to identify similar patterns with other performers and entertainment industry figures. Tony learned that Vincent had cultivated friendships with at least 15 other entertainers over the years, using each relationship to validate different criminal operations. Some performers had been used to legitimize fake recording companies, others to support phantom concert businesses. "The scope of Torrino's operations is staggering," Detective Rodriguez said. "He created a parallel entertainment industry that existed only to facilitate money laundering. Your friendship provided the initial credibility that made everything else possible." But the investigation had uncovered something even more troubling. Evidence that Vincent Torrino Jr. had been planning to exploit his friendship with Tony in ways that went far beyond financial fraud. We found documents suggesting that Torrino was planning to use compromising information about various entertainment industry figures for blackmail purposes, the detective explained. He had been collecting personal information about his celebrity friends for decades, apparently planning to use it for extortion when his other criminal enterprises became too risky. Detective Rodriguez showed Tony copies of files that Vincent had compiled about him over 30 years of friendship. The files contained detailed information about Tony's family relationships, health issues, financial arrangements, and personal habits. Information that could only have been gathered through careful surveillance and systematic betrayal of trust. He knew about your wife's medical treatments, your grandchildren's schools, your daily routines, your financial investments, the detective said. He had been preparing to blackmail you if necessary, using information gathered during decades of friendship. Tony realized that his relationship with Vincent had been even more dangerous than he had understood. Not only had Vincent exploited their friendship for financial crimes, but he had also been positioning himself to destroy Tony's reputation and personal life, if doing so had become advantageous. Detective Rodriguez, if Vincent had succeeded in blackmail, what damage could he have done? Potentially devastating damage. He had enough personal information to embarrass you professionally, harm your family relationships, and damage your financial security. He had developed a detailed understanding of your character and vulnerabilities. The investigation also revealed that Vincent's criminal network had connections to organized crime families going back generations. Vincent Jr. was part of a criminal dynasty that had been infiltrating the entertainment industry for decades. Your friendship with Vincent wasn't random, Mr. Bennett. His father had identified you as a target in the 1960s. Vincent Jr. was instructed to cultivate a relationship with you as part of a long-term strategy. Tony felt the weight of 40 years of manipulation. His friendship hadn't just been exploited for financial gain, it had been part of a multi-generational criminal strategy. The good news, Detective Rodriguez continued, is that Torrino never implemented his blackmail scheme. Your testimony disrupted his operations before he could move to the next phase. But there was more disturbing news. The investigation had uncovered evidence that Vincent's criminal network was still active. We believe that Torrino's conviction has disrupted but not eliminated the criminal organization. Other members are still active, and they may try to continue exploiting the entertainment industry relationships that Torrino developed. Detective Rodriguez warned Tony that he might still be a target, even with Vincent in prison. You should be aware that your friendship with Torrino may have made you a permanent target. They have access to all the personal information he gathered, and they understand your vulnerabilities. Tony felt exhausted by the scope of the betrayal. Not only had a 40-year friendship been revealed as a criminal conspiracy, but the danger to his family was ongoing. What can I do to protect myself and my family? Be extremely cautious about new friendships, especially with people who seem eager to get close to you. Report any suspicious approaches. And consider working with our financial crimes unit to review your business relationships. Over the following months, Tony worked with law enforcement to review decades of relationships. The process was emotionally devastating. The investigation ultimately led to the prosecution of 12 additional members of Vincent's network and recovery of $4 million in stolen funds. But for Tony, the victory felt hollow. The knowledge that he had been systematically deceived for 40 years had changed his understanding of trust. "I used to believe that you could judge people by how they treated you," Tony told Susan. "Now I understand that some people can maintain false friendships for decades, and that kindness can make you a target for sophisticated criminals." But the experience also taught Tony important lessons about informed caution. He learned to be more careful about sharing personal information, more skeptical of people who seemed eager to get close. "I don't want to become cynical," Tony said, "but I also can't afford to be as trusting as I was before. The cost of being wrong about someone's character is too high." The jury duty experience that had begun as a civic obligation had become a profound education in the complex relationships between trust, loyalty, and justice. Tony had learned that doing the right thing sometimes requires betraying people who don't deserve loyalty, but he had also learned that the most trustworthy people can sometimes be the most dangerous. Most importantly, he had learned that even at 97, life could still present moral challenges that tested everything he thought he knew. The jury summons that had seemed like an inconvenience had become one of the most important experiences of his life.